Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby, and I am here with the Oscar-nominated sound designers of Dune, Mark Mangini, Theo Green, and congratulations on this nomination. Very well deserved for your work on this. And it's a continuation, actually, of working with Denis Villeneuve. You both were also nominated for Blade Runner 2049. And I'm interested, when you work with a director multiple times, that also was a massive epic sci-fi film. How did that sort of prepare you for working on this one?
It's the introduction to Denis on Blade Runner 2049 really set the tone for what Dune would ultimately become. Denis is a very consistent filmmaker. He's a very brilliant filmmaker and a very progressive filmmaker. And that became a template for Dune. And I'm going to hand this off to Theo in just a moment. One of the very progressive things that Denis does is that sound, Theo and I are engaged, unlike almost all films, we're engaged as early as the screenwriting and pre-production phase, and even more so during the actual filming stage, where we're having a material impact on the edit as it's developing, as Denis shooting it, because sound is integrally and symbiotically informing the way Joe edits. Sometimes, and this I'll now hand off to Theo. Theo is that component of that approach of Denis, which is so revolutionary. He's designing sounds that sometimes happen before the edit happens or in response to the edit, and then there's a beautiful exchange. So Theo, please finish that thought.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, and to go back to your question, I think the things about Blade Runner 2049 that helped set us up for Dune were partly that we knew that we were all invited to kind of throw ideas around that aren't just to do with strictly sound design, but also things that potentially affected the story. So I mean, I remember on Blade Runner 2049 there was a scene that was going to get cut out, the one with Elvis in the casino. Finally we found a solution of cutting out a lot of the VFX work and making it sort of a scene where the holograms are broken and glitching out, and it was a very different thing. And as a result, it fitted the tone of the movie and went back in. So I guess learning from that, Mark and I, and Ron and Doug, who we'd worked with as the mixers, Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill for Blade Runner 2049. Knowing that we were all going to be working as a band again together, and knowing that we were all invited to, and Denis has open ears for ideas coming from us that he may be able to fit into the script and find ways of telling the story with sound. It just meant that we were all reading the script eagerly, suggesting things, thinking about what languages might sound like, thinking what the voice might contribute to it. So that's the main thing. I might start on the process a little earlier than some of the other guys, but at the same time, Mark and I were already right from the start on doing batting ideas around together on what kind of stuff we were going to do, what things should sound like, what the big ticket items that they needed to really hear early on would be. Yeah.
And telling a story with sound is very important in this movie, because I talked to Denis about the film, and he was saying, my dream was to make a film with no dialogue. And it's not it really leads with a visual storytelling, and that, your sound design is really heightened in that sense. It's very prominent in the storytelling because of that. Did that change the way you sort of had to approach it from how you normally operate?
I would say that Denis is unique in that he encourages us to use sound as vital a tool, as vital a narrative storytelling tool as sound can be. We're not often encouraged. Often sound is vital to science fiction, and if you see something you've never seen before, you need to create a sound you've never heard before, and that often encourages sound designers to create fantastical sound. Denis' encouragement is really for often the sound to have a component, a much higher utility, which is to offer a story point. So, and I'm sure we'll get to this, our development of sounds for the voice and the thumper, for example, have, and even the worms' vocalizations have a narrative component that goes beyond, and I'm going to use a very fancy word, diegetic utility. Diegetic simply means a sound that relates to something you see on screen. That's the easiest kind of sound design. You see something, you make a sound for it. But if in the process you can also tell a little bit of story, it's so much more valuable. And that's where Denis is such a vital ally in this process.
Well, I'd love to dive into the voice actually, because it's a core part of this story. It's this power that some of these women have. It's very terrifying when Charlotte Rampling does it. How did you sort of land on that specific sound? What was the process there?
A long one. That was really, when I said that Mark and I and Ron and Doug and everyone were kind of invited to participate with our ideas right from the start, that was one of them where we all had a little go at sort of what we thought the voice might sound like. It was an open discussion with Denis for a long time, as he'd always flagged it as being really his number one, it has to be right sound for the film. And therefore the thing that he was, the most nervous about us being able to pull off, because whilst he wants the whole world to be incredibly believable and almost documentary real in some aspects, here is, one of the few aspects that it's not supernatural. In fact, in the context of the books, it's supposed to be, a real world skill that people are able to develop without any sort of supernatural powers or without any technology. So it had to come across as, something that someone might organically be able to produce from their body. And yet we need to feel it as if something weapon-like has, assaulted us, and we have to believe that someone hearing that voice would have to do the bidder's command. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a convincing part of the story, for one thing. One of the things that Denis really helped guide us on was that it shouldn't just be an effect. It shouldn't just be, like a plugin that we can put. It shouldn't just be like echoes or something like this, or a classic sort of creature voice transform thing. I mean, that's definitely the wrong direction. And the way that he steered us very helpfully was to say, this is an ancient Bene Gesserit skill. The reason that Paul is learning it is because he's being kind of let in on the secrets of the Bene Gesserit, and he's developed, perhaps he even is the Kwisatz Haderach that the Bene Gesserit had been prophesying. So if that's the case, then how do we show that this is a talent, this is a skill that is part of the kind of the Bene Gesserit world? And one of the things that I think, Mark and I were thinking early on, how do we make it more about performance and less about, effects, plugins and stuff. And I don't know quite where the suggestion came up from, but, Mark had the idea of going to cast, or at least to present certain voices to Denis and have them, symbolize an ancient Bene Gesserit voice, something. And I think we also suggested, we could have the feeling that not just when someone uses the voice do you hear whispers of an ancient kind of voice, as if there's a spirit guide or a spirit voice that's part of it. But what if, we almost take a kind of quick scan through the Bene Gesserit ancestral tree, and we hear like an ancient ancestor, and then the original ancestor, whoever, first developed this voice, maybe speaking, in an ancient tongue or something. So that was like, it's what in the final effect of the voice, it's one of the kind of after effects or side effects of the voice that we hear, is this kind of these layers of almost inside someone's mind, the voices of the ancient Bene Gesserits affecting them. Then, of course, we also needed something that just punches you in the gut. And very much if you're, in the cinema, you feel a kind of resonating bass that comes out of the voice. And rather than using kind of, plugins and tricks, one of the things that we did to create that was an old trick that's known as worldizing, where you play something through a speaker, and, in this case, a very large bass cabinet, and you let that kind of rattle the room that it's in, and you record that. So you get a sense that it's not so much about something coming from a person as how the person is affecting the space that they're in. And that obviously changes based on whether you're in, the library with Reverend Mother Mohayam, or whether you're in an ornithopter with a couple of Harkonnens. You hear the atmosphere kind of gets sucked out. You hear these ancient voices. You hear this whoomp inside your chest. So it's kind of multi-layered, but very much what we were trying to do there is suggest that this is spiritual technology, not, some sort of bionic ability.
And if we kind of switch from a human voice to a non-human one, the sandworm, I wouldn't even know where to begin to try and say what does a sandworm vocalization sound like, but it's incredible when he when he faces off with it. So how do you where does inspiration come from when you have to create sound for a creature like that?
Well, this goes back to what we just talked about a moment ago, about this idea of having sound be something more than just diegetic, that if there's a story component to it, it adds value. And in that regard, our first attempts at the worm voice treated it more as a monster. And that was not a success with Denis, because we weren't really tracking what that moment is about, which was meant to be a moment of reverence. Paul is effectively seeing the God of the desert, and we did not want that to be a scare moment. So it got us thinking that there's some connectivity, because at the same time we're developing the sounds for the thumper, and we're thinking thumper worm. There's a unique sonic relationship between those two, and we knew that the thumper had to go thump, thump, thump. It's our equivalent of a futuristic duck call, to lure the prey. And so we thought, well, perhaps the worm should mimic the thumper, or maybe did the thumper mimic the worm? We don't know which, historically speaking, but we thought if we created a storytelling relationship, it just had that much more value. That led us in the direction of making a syncopated or rhythmic sound for the worm voice versus what you would expect in a science fiction film. And this is one of the beautiful things about Denis Villeneuve. We never want to ever do anything that the audience might expect or anything that resembles a trope. So we did not do the big rah. Instead, we did gunk, 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 gunk in the rhythm of the thump, 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 thump.
Yeah, and I'll circle back to something I was going to say earlier, which is that very much throughout, we were looking for opportunities to, the word world building, or as we said, universe building in this case, is a very important thing in sci-fi, and finding connective material, thematic things that you can, repeat and that resonate with each other was very, very important to us. So like, the thumper and the worm, but also those are both vibrations. The worm moving through the sand is a vibration. You see the sand kind of fluttering and vibrating. The shields are a kind of vibration. And we learned that the shield can't be used in the desert because the vibration attracts the worm. So there's this whole kind of strange interconnectivity between quite a lot of the sounds that we designed. And I think, rather than just being fancy, the reason for that is that it gets you deeper into the world. It makes you believe that things are interconnected, that there are reasons for things that, we don't have time to have a scene with someone explaining this stuff, but if you can feel it, if you can hear it, if you sort of, almost in the same way that music, applies a theme and then brings it up again later to remind you of the interconnectedness of a scene. So often sound design can be very piecemeal, you just look at what's happening in the scene and maybe even just what's on the screen rather than sort of what's off the screen. But I think we were trying all the time and encouraged by Denis all the time to find ways to knit these little threads of the world that Frank Herbert had created together.
It's interesting you use that word interconnected, because another thing, I've just rewatched this, and what seemed interconnected to me was your design and the score, Hans Zimmer's score, because there's even moments where I was like, oh, is that sound design or score coming from there? What is that relationship like between sound and score?
The relationship I really want Theo to flesh this out, but it starts back on Blade Runner 2049, where one of Denis' exhortations to Theo and I was to erase the boundaries. His goal as a filmmaker is to leave you not necessarily wondering, but hopefully not thinking about it. If you go to see a Denis Villeneuve movie and just feel as though this is the sound of the movie without parsing, even as a film aficionado or critic, oh, that was a great cue, that was great sound design, you're more engaged in the cinema than the deconstruction in your subconscious. And so we work very carefully and closely with Hans to try to erase those boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been of the opinion that, music is made of sounds, and sounds are often very musical. And indeed, we use almost exactly the same tools that a composer is using. Why is it that it's so traditionally, separate, that to the extent where many times I've been going to a final mix and I've not heard the score before, and the composer hasn't heard my sound before, so it's kind of like a toss-up what happens in the mix. I think it's very, very wise of Denis to have this sense of, let's try to connect these parts. It helps us, it helps the final result, because we haven't got that completely random event in the final mix. Everything has been discussed, pre-planned. There's been constant little sidebars where we're passing each other a sound or an instrument or something that we think the other person might like to use or integrate in some way. So there's that. And then, I mean, I think when you listen to, I've just been listening back to some of the backgrounds and ambiences that Mark and I created for Dune. And they do often play very much like a sort of ambient music. I mean, they communicate a lot more than just air to tell you about what's going on in the scene. And, again, that's partly us just getting deep into the world and thinking about what do the people on Arrakis and in the city of Arrakeen believe, and how do they go about their belief system, and what might you hear from that off screen, and just trying to sort of flesh out parts of the world that we don't necessarily have time to go and look at, because the book Dune is so full of like rich detail. And as I've heard Joe Walker, our editor, saying, it's almost fractal. The deeper you go into, the more you zoom into it, the more you see other details appearing, and they're all interconnected. So yeah, we very much tried to get that sense of details of the book coming through.
I just want to add a little footnote to that, and that is, again, part of the genius of Denis, because we have this collaboration with Hans and his team. When Denis gets that process is very empowering for Denis and any director, because when we get to a final mix, Denis refers to all of this as his old friends. That's a term he uses because he's vetted the score, he's vetted the sound effects, and that empowers him to be his fullest director self in a mix, because he's not having to micromanage sounds he's never heard before or music he's never heard before. He can now truly conduct the orchestra knowing exactly what he has.
Guys, I have to interrupt with a strange coincidence that's just happened. And we haven't talked about it yet, but one of the things that we created the sound of the ornithopter from was a certain kind of beetle that I'd recorded. And as if by magic, that exact type of beetle that in Hungary they call a poloshka has just landed on my keyboard.
Are you kidding?
I'm just going to see if I can slowly bring it up to the camera. It'll fly off, I'm sure. The horrible bugs, these.
Show an ornithopter to the world.
This little guy. Oh no! Now my computer's sort of editing it out with the back screen there. But hold on.
I see it on the J key or something.
Yeah. It's these little sort of shield-shaped bugs.
Maybe this is like
a real-life ornithopter.
It is. Basically, this is the source of the ornithopter. I think he wants to talk about it. I'm not going to kill him, I promise.
Tell us what letters the bug walks on, and if that spells something.
It's like a Ouija board. It was on a bracket, actually. I don't know what that means, but yeah, we were always looking for kind of organic, real life sources for our sounds. I think that's, one of the things that we kept circling back to is we have to search the world that we have for the sounds that we can take from it and transform into aspects of Dune. That's the only way that we're going to get something that sounds real enough. So even if it's one of these little fellas, slowed down, we still get sort of just an impression of a bug's wings in the sound of an ornithopter. Not enough to be some sort of totally fanciful, bizarro sound, but we found ways of sampling things from reality and introducing them into the sound design so that everything feels real rather than computerized or synthesized
or electronic.
Anyway, this guy just reminded me of that. I'm just calling him down now. I'm not going to try and show them to you again, but
I'm so glad that happened, and I know I have to let you guys go. And I don't think I could top a real life ornithopter appearing anyway. So we will end it there. Congratulations on your Oscar nomination. It's wonderful work in Dune. And if you're out there watching, subscribe to Gold Derby. Keep up to date with us throughout this season. And Mark and Theo, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Pleasure.